Have you ever felt invisible in a room full of people, like your life stopped mattering the moment you turned 50? Have you ever sat alone at a gathering, watching others laugh and connect, wondering if anyone would even notice if you simply disappeared? Elsbeth knows this feeling well. Tonight, at the blood moon feast that comes once every 10 years, she sits at the edge of celebration, enduring mockery from neighbors who see only a bitter old widow. But the quiet stranger beside her sees something different. His gentle voice and knowing eyes carry secrets older than the castle walls around them. When the crowd turns cruel and wine becomes their weapon, something ancient awakens. For 300 years he has walked among them, keeping peace through careful restraint. But tonight, that restraint breaks. What happens when two lonely souls discover they are not as powerless as the world believes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient stone chalice gleamed dull silver in the firelight, its carved surface worn smooth by countless hands over the centuries. Tonight, it would hold wine blessed by moonlight, as it had every decade for longer than memory could reach. The blood moon feast was no celebration, it was duty, tradition, and perhaps something darker that the village elders whispered about in hushed tones. Elsbeth Thorne adjusted her worn velvet cloak and gazed up at the crumbling castle that crowned the hill above her village. Blackthorn Keep had stood for 800 years, its massive stones weathered but unbroken, its towers reaching toward a sky that promised storm. Tonight, that sky held something else. A moon the color of fresh blood, hanging low and swollen above the battlements. She had not wanted to come. For 3 years since Henrik's death, she had found excuses to avoid the village gatherings. Her neighbors whispered that grief had made her strange, that she talked to her herbs as if they were old friends and preferred the company of her garden to human conversation. They were not entirely wrong, but tradition demanded attendance at the blood moon feast. Even bitter widows who preferred solitude to society could not ignore the summons when it came carved in stone and delivered by the village magistrate. The feast occurred only when the blood moon rose full and red above Blackthorn. Keep sometimes 9 years apart, sometimes 11, but always inevitable. The castle courtyard buzzed with nervous energy as villagers arrived in their finest clothes, most patched and mended but clean. Torches lined the ancient walls, casting dancing shadows that made the gargoyles perched above seem to move and breathe. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meat, fresh bread, wheels of yellow cheese, and casks of wine that had been aging since the last blood moon. Martha, Brewster, the innkeeper's wife, waved Elsbeth toward a table near the castle's great entrance. "Come, dear one, sit with us. No need to stand apart on such a night." Elsbeth appreciated the kindness, but Martha's table was already crowded with the younger mothers and their husbands. She would be the odd one out, the widow without children, the woman whose womb had remained stubbornly empty through 15 years of marriage. Better to find a quiet corner where she could observe without being observed. She chose a spot at the far end of the courtyard, where shadows pooled thick between torches and the conversation would be softer. The wooden bench was worn smooth by weather and time, comfortable enough for an evening of careful solitude. From here, she could watch the festivities without participating, fulfill her obligation without enduring pity or well-meaning questions about when she might consider remarrying. The wine was surprisingly good, rich and dark, with hints of blackberry and something else she could not identify. Her herbalist's palate detected unusual notes, as if the grapes had grown in soil touched by starlight. She sipped carefully, mindful that she would need to walk home along the winding hill path when the evening ended. Around her, the feast unfolded in familiar patterns. The blacksmith's family claimed their traditional table near the warming fires. Young couples stole glances and shy touches, while their parents pretended not to notice. Children darted between the tables until their mothers corralled them with sharp words and gentle hands. But something felt different tonight. The laughter seemed forced, the conversations too loud. Every few minutes, someone would glance toward the moon and make a quick sign against evil. The older villagers clustered together, their voices dropping to whispers when they thought no one was listening. Elder Thomas Greywater stood near the ancient chalice, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the gathering. At 83, he was the oldest person in the village, keeper of stories that stretched back through generations. His great-grandfather had been present at the first blood moon feast anyone could remember, and Thomas carried those memories like sacred trust. "The moon rises full tonight," he announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard despite its tremulous quality. "As it has for our fathers and their fathers before them, we gather, as our ancestors gathered, to honor the old agreements and keep the ancient peace." Agreements. Peace. The word sent a chill down Elsbeth's spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. What agreements? Peace with whom? She had lived in this village for 32 years, since Henrik had brought her here as his young bride, but no one had ever explained the deeper meaning behind the blood moon feast. It was simply something they did, like planting crops in spring or storing grain for winter. A commotion near the castle gates drew her attention. The crowd was parting to admit a latecomer unusual, since most villagers had arrived before sunset. Elsbeth leaned forward, curious despite herself, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever was important enough to make an entrance after the blessing had begun. The man who emerged from the shadows moved with fluid grace, as if walking required no effort at all. He was tall but not imposing, dressed in deep red that seemed to absorb torchlight rather than reflect it. His face was lean and aristocratic, with high cheekbones and a mouth that suggested he smiled rarely but meant it when he did. Dark hair swept back from a broad forehead, and his skin held the pale perfection of someone who spent little time in sunlight. But it was his eyes that made Elsbeth's breath catch. Even at this distance, even in flickering firelight, they seemed to hold depths that spoke of years beyond counting. When his gaze swept across the courtyard, people stepped back instinctively, as if recognizing something they could not name. He paused at the edge of the gathering, clearly seeking a place to sit. Most tables were full, and those with empty spaces seemed to fill quickly as their occupants suddenly remembered distant cousins who might join them. Elsbeth watched this silent rejection with growing indignation. Whoever this man was, he deserved better treatment than the cold shoulder her neighbors were providing. Without fully understanding why, she raised her hand and gestured toward the empty space beside her on the worn wooden bench. "There is room here, if you do not mind the company of a widow who talks more to plants than people." The stranger's head turned toward her, and those ancient eyes focused on her face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable. Instead, she felt seen for the first time in months, not as the bitter widow or the strange herbalist, but as a person worthy of attention. "Thank you," he said, moving toward her with that same flowing grace. His voice was cultured, with an accent she could not place, as if he had learned to speak in a different century. "I am Aldrich, and you are very kind to offer sanctuary to a stranger on such a night." Sanctuary, an odd word choice, but fitting somehow. Elsbeth Thorne. "I tend the herb garden behind the old mill, if you know it." "I know it well. Your lavender is particularly fine this year, and the chamomile holds exceptional potency. You have skilled hands and a generous heart. The plants respond to such care." Elsbeth blinked in surprise. Most villagers avoided her garden, claiming it made them nervous to see her talking to the growing things as if they could understand. But this man spoke of her work with knowledge and respect that warmed her more than the wine. "You know herbs?" she asked, making room for him on the bench. He settled beside her with minimal sound, as if his body weighed less than it should. "I have studied them, yes, for many years. There is old knowledge in the growing things, wisdom that modern folk too often forget." He paused, considering his words carefully. "Your garden holds varieties I have not seen elsewhere, some that were thought lost to common cultivation. "My grandmother's seeds," Elsbeth explained, pleased to find someone who appreciated her work. "She taught me that plants remember their histories, that careful tending can preserve what others abandon." Aldrich smiled, and the expression transformed his austere features into something unexpectedly warm. "A wise woman, your grandmother. Such knowledge deserves preservation." They fell into comfortable conversation as the feast continued around them. Aldrich knew not only herbs but their applications, which combinations eased winter coughs, how to harvest moon-blessed plants for maximum potency, the proper way to dry roots so their essence remained strong. He spoke with the authority of long experience, yet something in his manner suggested the knowledge came from sources deeper than books or formal training. "You are not from our village," Elsbeth observed, after he correctly identified a difficult question about mixing tinctures. "Your knowledge suggests training in places we do not have." "I am a traveller," he replied, which was no answer at all. "I have been fortunate to study with many teachers over the years." The evasion might have annoyed her from someone else, but Aldrich delivered it with such gentle courtesy that she found herself accepting the mystery. Everyone carried secrets. Hers included conversations with plants and dreams of the children she had never born. If this kind stranger preferred privacy about his past, she would respect that choice. The wine continued to flow, and the feast grew livelier as inhibitions loosened. Someone had brought a fiddle, and dancing began near the castle's main entrance. Young couples spun and laughed, while their elders clapped encouragement from the sidelines. Even the children joined in, weaving between the adult dancers with the fearless joy of youth. But Elsbeth noticed that no one approached their quiet corner. Servers refilled wine cups at every other table, but seemed to forget theirs existed. When children chased each other through the courtyard, they gave their bench a wide berth, as if some invisible barrier warned them away. "They fear you," she realized, studying Aldrich's profile in the torchlight. "Why?" His hands tightened almost imperceptibly on his wine cup, the first sign of tension she had seen from him. "Perhaps they sense that I am different. People often fear what they do not understand." "Different how?" Before he could answer, Elder Greywater's voice rose above the music and laughter. "The moon reaches its zenith. Let the chalice be filled, and let the toast be spoken." The ancient stone chalice was lifted high, wine dark as blood gleaming in its depths. Elder Greywater's hands shook with age, and something that might have been fear, as he spoke words that sounded older than the castle itself. "To the watchers in shadow, to the guardians unseen, to the compact made in blood and starlight, to the peace that has endured. May the old agreements hold, may the ancient hunger sleep, and may we wake to see another decade's dawn." A chill ran through the gathered crowd as they raised their own cups in response. "To the watchers in shadow," they murmured, voices uncertain but obedient. "To the guardians unseen." Elsbeth felt the words resonate in her bones, as if they carried power she was only beginning to understand. Beside her, Aldrich had grown very still, his pale hands motionless on his wine cup as he watched the ceremony with unreadable eyes. The toast was drunk in silence, wine disappearing down 100 throats, while the blood moon looked down from its throne of stars. Then, as if released from a spell, the villagers returned to their celebrating with renewed fervor, talking too loudly, laughing too hard, determinedly ignoring the shadows that seemed to press closer around the torchlit gathering. "What was that about?" Elsbeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aldrich turned those ancient eyes to her, and for a moment she thought she glimpsed something vast and lonely in their depths. "Old traditions," he said carefully. "Old promises that keep the darkness at bay." She wanted to ask more, but something in his manner warned her that this was not the time or place for such questions. Instead, she settled for studying his profile in the firelight, noting the sharp perfection of his features and the way shadows seemed to cling to him despite the brightness of the torches. The night was still young, and the blood moon feast would continue until dawn touched the eastern sky. But already Elsbeth sensed that this evening would change something fundamental in her quiet life. Whether for good or ill, she could not say, only that the stranger beside her carried mysteries that would not easily be ignored. Around them, the villagers continued their celebration, unaware that their careful traditions might be about to shift in ways none of them could imagine. The torn velvet cloak that had once been Elsbeth's finest garment now hung heavy with wine and shame around her shoulders. What had begun as gentle mockery from the younger villagers had escalated into something far crueler as the night wore on, and inhibitions dissolved in cups of blessed wine. It started with Gareth Miller's wife, Millicent, whose tongue grew sharper with each refill of her cup. "Look at her there in the shadows," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry across several tables, "always lurking at the edges like some scavenging crow." Her companion, young Bethany Cooper, giggled behind her hand. "Mother says she talks to her plants because no person will listen to her rambling. Must be lonely, having only weeds for company." Elsbeth felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her gaze fixed on her wine cup. She had endured such comments before. The village had little patience for widows who failed to remarry promptly or fade gracefully into helpful invisibility. Her independence made them uncomfortable, as if her refusal to seek another husband somehow challenged their understanding of how women should behave. Beside her, Aldrich's posture had shifted almost imperceptibly. Where moments before he had seemed relaxed, now tension hummed through his frame like a bowstring drawn taut. His pale hands rested motionless on the table, but she noticed his knuckles had gone white with restraint. "Ignore them," she murmured, though her own voice betrayed the hurt she tried to hide. "Small minds find comfort in smaller words." "They should show respect," Aldrich replied, his cultured accent carrying an edge she had not heard before. "You deserve far better treatment than this." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her composure. When had anyone last defended her, even in whispered words? Henrik had been gone 3 years now, and with him had died the protection that marriage provided against casual cruelty. A widow alone was fair game for anyone seeking to feel superior at another's expense. Unfortunately, Millicent had apparently decided that subtle mockery was insufficient entertainment for a blood moon feast. Wine had loosened her tongue and emboldened her spite, and she rose from her bench with unsteady purpose. "Elsbeth Thorne," she called out, her voice carrying across the courtyard and drawing attention from nearby tables. "Still sitting alone, I see. Have you given up entirely on finding another husband, or do you think your withered charms might yet snare some poor fool?" Conversations quieted as people turned to witness the spectacle. Elsbeth felt dozens of eyes upon her, some sympathetic but most merely curious to see how she would respond to such public humiliation. Her mouth went dry, and she reached for her wine cup with hands that trembled slightly. "Perhaps she prefers the company of her herbs to any man," suggested Bethany, emboldened by Millicent's example. "I hear she speaks to them as if they were lovers. Must be desperate for conversation after 3 years of solitude." The laughter that followed felt like physical blows. Not cruel laughter, most of the villagers were not intentionally malicious, but the uncomfortable chuckling of people who recognized meanness but were grateful not to be its target. Such sounds hurt worse than honest cruelty, because they revealed how easily good people became complicit in small evils. Elsbeth rose carefully from the bench, intending to leave with whatever dignity remained to her. But Millicent was not finished. "Running away already, but we were just beginning to enjoy your company." The young woman swayed slightly, wine sloshing in her cup as she gestured broadly. "Tell us, Elsbeth, what do your precious plants say to you? Do they offer comfort for a barren woman's empty bed? Do they whisper sweet promises about the children you never bore?" The words hit their mark with vicious precision. Elsbeth stopped walking, her body going rigid with pain that had nothing to do with her torn cloak or wounded pride. The childlessness that had shadowed her marriage, that had made her feel like a failure as a woman, was being used as entertainment for drunken neighbors who should have known better. That is enough. Aldrich's voice cut through the laughter like a blade through silk. He had not raised his tone, but something in its quality made every conversation in the courtyard stop. Even the musicians paused mid-song, their instruments falling silent, as if responding to a conductor's unheard command. He stood with fluid grace, and in the torchlight, his pale skin seemed to carry its own luminescence. His dark eyes, which had been gentle when focused on Elsbeth, now held depths that promised consequences for those foolish enough to test them further. "You will apologize," he said, addressing Millicent with cold courtesy that somehow felt more threatening than shouted anger. "Now." Millicent blinked at him, her wine-fuzzed mind struggling to process the sudden shift in dynamics. Around the courtyard, people had begun to step back instinctively, as if recognizing danger they could not name. "Who are you to tell me what I will or will not do?" she demanded, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Some stranger has no right to—" Her words cut off abruptly as Aldrich's gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made the air itself seem to thicken. Without conscious thought, her hand rose to her throat as if feeling suddenly short of breath. "I am someone who knows the value of kindness," Aldrich replied, his tone never rising above conversational levels, "and the price of its absence. You will apologize to Mistress Thorne, and you will do so sincerely, or you will discover that some discourtesies carry consequences you are not prepared to face." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. More than that, it carried a weight that suggested it could be backed up in ways that defied normal understanding. Millicent's face had gone pale beneath her wine flush, and her hands shook as she set down her cup with excessive care. She began, then stopped, swallowing hard as if fighting some invisible pressure on her throat. "Forgive me, Elsbeth, my words were unkind. I spoke from wine, not wisdom." The apology was forced but genuine in its fear. Elsbeth found herself nodding acceptance, though her attention was fixed more on Aldrich than on Millicent's stammered words. How had he commanded such immediate submission from someone who moments before had been confident in her cruelty? But Millicent's husband, Gareth, was apparently too drunk to recognize the danger his wife had instinctively felt. He rose from his own bench, flushed with anger and wine, and pointed an accusatory finger at Aldrich. "How dare you threaten my wife, stranger? Who do you think you are? Coming to our feast and presuming to tell us how to behave?" Before anyone could stop him, Gareth grabbed his wine cup and hurled its contents directly at Elsbeth. The dark liquid struck her full in the chest, soaking through the worn velvet of her cloak and spreading across the fabric like a bloodstain. The precious garment, the one fine thing she had left from her marriage, was ruined in an instant. The gesture was petty and spiteful, designed to put her back in her place and show the stranger that outsiders held no authority here. But Gareth had severely miscalculated both his target and his audience. The change in Aldrich was immediate and terrifying. One moment he stood calmly beside the bench, the next he seemed to exist in a different space entirely, as if reality had shifted to accommodate his presence. His eyes went completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible surface, like looking into deep water under a moonless sky. The temperature around their corner of the courtyard dropped by what felt like 20 degrees. Torches flickered despite the absence of wind, and shadows seemed to reach out from the castle walls with grasping fingers. Several people cried out in alarm, though none could have said exactly what frightened them. When Aldrich spoke, his voice carried harmonics that human throats could not produce, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect, impossible unison. "You have made a grave error in judgment." Gareth stumbled backward, wine cup falling from nerveless fingers to shatter on the ancient stones. His face had gone white as fresh snow, and his mouth moved soundlessly as he tried to form words that would not come. Around the courtyard, the blood moon feast came to a complete stop. Conversations died mid-sentence, children pressed closer to their parents. Even the servants emerging from the castle kitchens froze in place, as if some primitive instinct warned them that movement might draw unwelcome attention. The silence stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours, broken only by the distant sound of wind through the castle battlements and the soft drip of wine falling from Elsbeth's ruined cloak. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Aldrich's eyes returned to their normal dark brown, the temperature rose to comfortable levels, and torches burned steady and bright once more. But the damage was done. Everyone present had felt something beyond normal human experience, and no amount of rational explanation would entirely erase that memory. Aldrich turned to Elsbeth with infinite gentleness, as if the terrifying display had never occurred. "You are hurt," he said, his accent once again cultured and calm. "Let me help you." She stood frozen, wine dripping from her cloak onto the worn stones, staring at the man who had just revealed himself to be something far more than he appeared. Fear and fascination warred in her chest, along with a growing understanding that her quiet life had just taken a turn towards something unprecedented and possibly dangerous. "Who are you?" she whispered, the question carrying years of loneliness and the sudden, desperate hope that she was not as alone as she had always believed. Father Benedict's weathered hands trembled as he clutched the hand-carved wooden cross that hung from his neck, its ancient wood worn smooth by decades of desperate prayers and fervent faith. The old priest had served this village for 40 years, baptizing its children and burying its dead, but nothing in his theological training had prepared him for what he had just witnessed in Blackthorn Keep's courtyard. Aldrich's gentle touch on Elsbeth's wine-stained cloak was a stark contrast to the supernatural display that had silenced the entire feast moments before. His fingers worked carefully at the fabric, and somehow impossibly the dark stains began to fade and disappear, as if the wine had never touched the worn velvet at all. "Come," he said softly, his voice once again carrying nothing more threatening than concern for her well-being. "Let us find a quieter place away from prying eyes." Elsbeth allowed herself to be guided toward one of the castle's shadowed alcoves, her mind struggling to process what she had seen. The man beside her moved with the same fluid grace as before, but now she understood that the unnaturally smooth gait came from something beyond mere poise or breeding. When he had spoken in that voice of impossible harmonics, when his eyes had gone black as midnight water, she had felt the presence of something ancient and powerful, wearing human form. The alcove provided blessed privacy from the stunned villagers who still stood motionless in the courtyard. Stone walls curved around them like protective arms, and a narrow window looked out over the valley where their village nestled in peaceful ignorance of the supernatural drama unfolding above. "Your cloak is repaired," Aldrich observed, running his fingers along fabric that should have been irreparably stained. "Though I fear the memory of this evening will not fade so easily." "The wine," Elsbeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It disappeared. How did you—" "There are many things in this world that defy common understanding," he replied, settling beside her on a stone bench worn smooth by centuries of use. "Some knowledge has been forgotten by most, though it lingers in old books and older hearts." She studied his profile in the moonlight that streamed through the narrow window. His features held classical perfection, as if carved by a master sculptor rather than shaped by natural birth. But it was the subtle wrongness that captured her attention now, the way shadows seemed to pool around him, despite the bright moon, the complete absence of breath mist, despite the cool night air, the stillness that suggested a heart that beat rarely, if at all. "You speak of generations. Past, as if you witnessed them yourself," she said carefully. "Your knowledge of herbs includes varieties my grandmother claimed were lost before her time. And what just happened in the courtyard was not mere scholarship or natural talent." Aldrich's hands stilled on the stone bench between them. For long moments, the only sounds were distant voices from the feast and wind sighing through the castle's ancient towers. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. "Some souls are granted longer journeys than others," he said. "I have been fortunate to study with teachers who preserved knowledge from earlier times. What you witnessed tonight was protective instinct, perhaps enhanced by emotions I rarely allow myself to feel." It was not quite an answer, but neither was it a complete evasion. Elsbeth recognized the delicate dance of revelation that occurred between people who carried secrets too large for casual sharing. Her own conversations with plants, her ability to sense the health and needs of growing things, had taught her to appreciate the difference between mysteries that harmed and those that simply existed beyond common understanding. "Those people had no right to treat you with such cruelty," Aldrich continued, his voice carrying genuine anger beneath its careful control. "Your knowledge of healing herbs, your gentle care for growing things, these are gifts that deserve respect, not mockery." "You defended me," she said, still marveling at the memory. "No one has done that since Henrik died." I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand between me and the world's casual cruelties. "Then the world has shown you far less kindness than you deserve." Before she could respond to the warmth in his tone, approaching footsteps echoed through the alcove. Father Benedict appeared at the entrance, his weathered face pale with concern and something that might have been fear. The wooden cross in his hands caught the moonlight, and he held it with the desperate grip of a drowning man clinging to driftwood. "Forgive the interruption," the priest said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "But I felt compelled to check on Mistress Thorne after such a disturbing incident." His eyes remained fixed on Aldrich with an intensity that spoke of recognition, or at least suspicion. The old priest had witnessed more than wine stains disappearing and temperatures dropping. He had felt the presence of something that challenged everything his faith had taught him about the nature of good and evil. "Your concern is appreciated, Father," Elsbeth replied, rising from the stone bench. "Though, as you can see, I am unharmed." "Indeed," Father Benedict agreed, though his gaze never left Aldrich. "Tell me, stranger, from what parish do you hail? I know most of the traveling clergy in this region, yet your manner suggests extensive theological training." Aldrich stood with that fluid grace that had first caught Elsbeth's attention, and she noticed that he made no move to approach the priest or the wooden cross that gleamed between them. "I am merely a scholar with interests in old texts and older wisdom. Nothing more than an aging man with too much time for study and too little for proper companionship." The statement was delivered with perfect courtesy, but Father Benedict's knuckles went white against the carved wood. Something in Aldrich's presence clearly challenged the priest's understanding of divine protection and holy authority. "Old texts can contain dangerous knowledge," Father Benedict said carefully. "The Church teaches that some wisdom is better left buried, lest it lead faithful souls toward temptation or worse." "Knowledge itself is rarely dangerous," Aldrich replied, his tone remaining conversational despite the obvious tension. "It is the application of knowledge without wisdom, or wisdom without compassion, that creates true peril." Elsbeth found herself caught between two worldviews that seemed fundamentally incompatible. Father Benedict represented everything she had been taught about faith, virtue, and the proper order of existence. But Aldrich offered something else: acceptance of mysteries that existed beyond church doctrine, respect for knowledge that came from sources other than approved texts. "Perhaps we should return to the feast," she suggested, hoping to diffuse the growing tension. "The evening grows late, and people will wonder at our long absence." Father Benedict nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on Aldrich. "Yes, the feast continues, though I suspect this blood moon will be long remembered by all who witnessed its strange happenings." As they emerged from the alcove, Elsbeth noticed that the courtyard had indeed returned to something resembling celebration. though conversations remained quieter than before, and people kept glancing toward the corner where the supernatural display had occurred. Gareth and Millicent were nowhere to be seen, apparently having decided that discretion was preferable to facing whatever consequences their actions might bring. The rest of the evening passed peacefully, though Elsbeth remained acutely aware of Aldrich's presence beside her and Father Benedict's watchful gaze from across the courtyard. She was beginning to understand that her simple desire for companionship had drawn her into something far more complex than a chance meeting with a learned stranger. Whatever Aldrich truly was, whatever secrets he carried in that perfect, impossible form, he had changed her life simply by choosing to sit beside her on a worn wooden bench. The question now was whether that change would bring salvation or destruction to her quiet world. The moonstone pendant that hung from Aldrich's neck caught the blood moon's light in ways that defied natural law, glowing with an inner radiance that pulsed in rhythm with celestial forces far older than human memory. Elsbeth noticed it first when they returned to their bench, the pale stone seeming to breathe with soft luminescence that had nothing to do with reflected torchlight. "Your pendant," she said, her herbalist's eye drawn to the unusual jewelry. "I have never seen moonstone glow with such intensity. Is it some variety I do not recognize?" Aldrich's hand moved instinctively to cover the pendant, but not before she caught a clearer glimpse of the intricate silver setting that held the stone. The metalwork was exquisite, featuring patterns that seemed to shift and flow when viewed from different angles, as if the silver itself were alive and responding to unseen currents. "It is very old," he said simply, though his fingers remained protectively over the pendant. "A family heirloom passed down through many generations. Sometimes old stones develop unusual properties through long exposure to moonlight and starshine." The explanation was reasonable enough, yet Elsbeth sensed layers of meaning beneath his carefully chosen words. She had spent enough time studying the properties of crystals and stones to know that moonstone, while beautiful, did not typically emit its own light. What she was seeing belonged more to legend than natural philosophy. As they settled back into conversation, the feast continued to swirl around them with renewed energy. The earlier supernatural display had paradoxically loosened rather than dampened the celebration, as if people were determined to prove that ordinary human joy could overcome any darkness. Wine flowed more freely, laughter rang louder, and the musicians played with increased fervor. But Elsbeth began to notice something that chilled her despite the warmth of the evening. While the general celebration had resumed, the villagers' behavior toward their corner of the courtyard remained markedly changed. Servers who had been attentive throughout the evening now avoided their table entirely, even when their wine cups stood empty. Children who had earlier run freely through the gathering now gave their bench a wide berth, as if responding to some instinctive warning. More unsettling still were the glances directed their way by the older villagers, not looks of curiosity or even fear, but of recognition. Elder Greywater stood near the ancient chalice, his weathered features thoughtful as he studied Aldrich's profile. Margaret Heatherby, whose family had lived in the village for 6 generations, whispered urgently to her daughter while pointing discreetly in their direction. Even young Tom Ashford, the blacksmith's apprentice, kept shooting nervous looks toward their bench while pretending to focus on the dancing. "They know you," Elsbeth realized, her voice barely audible above the music and laughter. "Not as a stranger, but as someone they recognize. How is that possible?" Aldrich was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured with the care of someone walking through a field of hidden traps. "Sometimes a face reminds people of old stories," he said. "Legends passed down through families, tales told by firesides on winter nights. The human mind seeks patterns, connections between present reality and remembered narratives." It was another non-answer disguised as explanation, but this time Elsbeth pressed for clarity. "What stories? What legends speak of men who can restore wine-stained fabric with a touch, whose eyes go black as midnight when they feel protective rage?" Before Aldrich could respond, young Anna Millwright approached their table with hesitant steps. The girl could not have been more than 8 years old, with golden hair braided with ribbons and a face that still held the fearless curiosity of childhood. Unlike the adults who avoided their corner, she walked directly to Aldrich with the straightforward manner of someone too young to understand why she should be afraid. "Are you the guardian?" she asked, her clear voice cutting through the adult conversations around them. "Grandmother says the guardian comes to every blood moon feast, but he looks different each time so people won't recognize him." The question sent a ripple of shocked silence through the nearby tables. Parents turned toward their daughter with expressions of horror, clearly mortified that the child had given voice to thoughts that should have remained unspoken. Anna's mother, Sarah Millwright, hurried forward with panic written across her features. "Anna, come away this instant. You must not bother the gentleman with your silly questions." But Aldrich raised a gentle hand to forestall the mother's intervention. "It is no bother," he said, his voice holding the warmth he had shown Elsbeth throughout the evening. "Children often see truths that adults choose to ignore." He studied the little girl's face with something that might have been wonder, as if he had not encountered such innocent directness in longer than he cared to remember. When he spoke again, his words carried careful honesty. "I am someone who has watched over this village for many years, little one. Whether that makes me a guardian depends on how one defines the word." Anna nodded solemnly, as if his answer confirmed something she had already suspected. "Grandmother says the guardian is very old and very sad, but he protects us from the bad things that want to hurt people. She says we should be grateful, even if we don't understand." "Your grandmother is a wise woman," Aldrich replied, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure slipped enough to reveal depths of loneliness that took Elsbeth's breath away. "Perhaps you should return to her now, before your parents worry about your safety." Anna skipped back toward the crowd with the carefree manner of a child who had satisfied her curiosity, but her innocent questions had opened doors that could not easily be closed. Around their table, conversations had quieted as people strained to hear any additional revelations. Even the musicians seemed to be playing more softly, as if the entire feast was holding its breath. Sarah Millwright lingered beside their bench, her face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been awe. "Forgive her boldness, sir. Children speak without thinking, especially when they hear too many old stories from their elders." "There is nothing to forgive," Aldrich assured her. "Curiosity is a virtue, not a fault. Your daughter sees clearly that is a gift to be treasured, not discouraged." After Sarah returned to her family, Elsbeth found herself studying Aldrich's profile with new understanding. The careful evasions, the impossible knowledge, the way shadows seemed to gather around him despite the bright moonlight, all of it began to form a picture that challenged everything she thought she knew about the world. "The guardian," she said quietly, "that is what you are, isn't it? The one the stories speak of, the protector who watches from shadows while the village sleeps in safety." Aldrich's moonstone pendant pulsed brighter, as if responding to the accuracy of her guess. Around them, the blood moon feast continued, but Elsbeth felt as if she was standing at the edge of a vast chasm that separated her old life from something entirely new and possibly dangerous. The truth was within reach now, hovering just beyond the careful words and gentle evasions. All she had to do was find the courage to grasp it. The iron horseshoe that hung above the castle's main entrance was older than memory, its black metal worn smooth by centuries of weather and blessed countless times by village priests. Traditional wisdom held that such iron would repel evil, that no creature of darkness could pass beneath its protective arch. Yet Aldrich had walked through that doorway without hesitation, without so much as a glance at the ancient ward that should have burned his supernatural flesh or turned him away entirely. Elsbeth had noticed this detail when he first arrived, though its significance had not struck her until Anna's innocent questions forced her to examine everything about the mysterious stranger through new eyes. Now, as they climbed the worn stone steps that led to the castle's battlements, she found herself cataloguing a dozen small impossibilities that painted an increasingly clear picture of what Aldrich truly was. "The view is particularly fine tonight," he said, offering his hand to help her navigate the uneven steps. "The blood moon illuminates the valley in ways that ordinary light cannot achieve." His touch was warm, another contradiction that defied the legends she had heard whispered around winter fires. The stories spoke of creatures whose flesh carried the chill of the grave, whose touch brought frost and decay. But Aldrich's hand was as warm as any living man's, though she noticed he required no effort to climb steps that left her slightly breathless. The battlements offered a sweeping view of the valley below, where their village nestled among rolling hills like a child's toy settlement. Lamplight glowed in cottage windows, and thin trails of smoke rose from chimneys into the crisp night air. It looked peaceful and innocent from this height, a place where supernatural concerns had no business intruding upon ordinary lives. "How long have you been watching over them?" Elsbeth asked, abandoning pretense in favor of direct inquiry. "The villagers, I mean. How many generations have passed beneath your protection?" Aldrich was silent for long moments, his hands resting on the ancient stone parapet as he gazed out over the sleeping settlement. When he finally answered, his voice carried the weight of accumulated years and carefully guarded memories. "I came here when the castle was new and the village barely more than a cluster of farms around a crossroads," he said. "The land was wilder then, and darker creatures than myself stalked the night. Someone needed to stand between innocence and predation. I found myself suited to the task." "Centuries," she breathed, trying to comprehend the scope of such a lifespan. "You have watched generations live and die, seen families rise and fall, observed the slow changes that time brings to everything mortal." "Yes," he agreed simply. "It is not always an easy burden to bear. There is deep loneliness in outliving everyone you come to care about, in watching the world change while you remain fundamentally unchanged." The pain in his voice resonated with her own understanding of loss and isolation. Her 3 years of widowhood were nothing compared to his centuries of solitary guardianship, yet she recognized the familiar ache of being fundamentally alone among people who could not truly understand her experience. "But you continue the vigil," she observed. "Despite the loneliness, despite watching everything you protect eventually fade into memory." "They deserve protection," Aldrich replied, his gaze moving from house to house in the valley below. "The baker who rises before dawn to provide fresh bread, the blacksmith who shoes horses with patient skill, the mother who tends her children through fever and fear, they are precious precisely because their time is limited. Mortality gives meaning to every choice, weight to every kindness." Elsbeth studied his profile in the moonlight, noting how the ancient stone seemed to frame him as if he belonged here among weathered battlements and timeless views. "What are you, truly? The stories speak of vampires and demons, werewolves and wraiths, but none of those legends seem to fit what I see before me. I am what I have chosen to become," he answered carefully. "Yes, I was once mortal, and yes, that mortality was taken from me through circumstances I did not seek. But the creature I became was shaped by choices I made freely to protect rather than prey, to cherish rather than consume, to find purpose in service rather than dominion." It was the most direct answer. He had given her all evening, yet it raised as many questions as it resolved. She wanted to know about his transformation, about the circumstances that had stolen his mortality and the choices that had defined his supernatural existence. But something in his manner suggested that such knowledge came with prices she might not be prepared to pay. "The other villagers recognize you," she said instead. "Not consciously, perhaps, but some part of them knows you have been here far longer than any human lifetime should allow." "Faces echo through generations," Aldrich agreed. "A grandmother tells stories to her grandchildren, describes the helpful stranger who appeared during some long-ago crisis. Those children grow old and tell their own grandchildren similar tales. Eventually, the stories accumulate enough detail that people begin to notice patterns, similarities that span decades or centuries. Is that why you usually avoid the blood moon feasts? To prevent such recognition? Aldrich turned toward her, and she saw something vulnerable in his ancient eyes. Partly, but also because celebration reminds me of everything I have lost, everyone I have failed to save despite my best efforts. Tonight was different. Tonight I found myself drawn to participation rather than observation. Why tonight? Because of you, he said simply, the honesty in his voice striking her like a physical blow. Because I saw someone else who understood loneliness, who carried loss with grace rather than bitterness. Because for the first time in longer than I care to remember, I wanted conversation more than solitude. The admission hung between them in the moonlit air, fragile and precious as spun glass. Elsbeth felt her heart quicken with emotions she had not experienced since Henrik's death: hope, attraction, the terrifying possibility of connection with someone who truly understood the weight of being different in a world that preferred conformity. "I should be afraid," she said softly. "Everything I was taught about creatures like you says that fear would be the rational response." "You would not be wrong to feel fear," Aldrich replied. "What I am carries dangers that kindness cannot entirely eliminate. Yet I am not afraid," she continued, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Perhaps I should be, but instead I find myself grateful for your presence, protective rage included." Below them, the village slept on in peaceful ignorance, while two impossibly different souls discovered they were not as alone as they had believed. The blood moon continued its ancient journey across the star-scattered sky, blessing their conversation with light that belonged to neither fully human nor fully supernatural realms, but to something rare and precious that existed in the spaces between. The blood-stained parchment lay hidden in a lead-lined chest deep within Blackthorn Keep's forgotten archives, its edges yellowed with age, and its crimson seal bearing symbols that predated Christian influence in the region. Elsbeth discovered it quite by accident when she and Aldrich sought shelter from a sudden rain squall that had driven the feast indoors to the castle's great hall. "There are chambers below the main floor," Aldrich had explained, guiding her through passages that seemed to exist outside normal architectural logic. "Places where we might speak without curious ears following our conversation." The hidden chamber they found was clearly ancient, its walls carved from living rock and lined with alcoves containing scrolls, books, and artifacts that spoke of knowledge deliberately preserved through centuries of changing beliefs. Torches ignited spontaneously at their approach, though Elsbeth noticed that Aldrich showed no surprise at this phenomenon. "What is this place?" she asked, running her fingers along leather-bound volumes whose titles were written in languages she could not identify. "A repository," Aldrich replied carefully. "Knowledge that was deemed too important to lose, too dangerous to display openly." The lords of Blackthorn Keep were not always as devoutly Christian as current generations might prefer to believe. It was while examining a particularly ornate chest that her touch accidentally triggered some hidden mechanism, causing the lid to spring open and reveal the ancient parchment within. The document was covered in flowing script that seemed to shift and writhe in the torchlight, and the dark stains that marked its surface carried a metallic scent that made her herbalist's instincts recoil. "Blood," she said with certainty. This was signed in blood. But whose, and why? Aldrich moved to her side with that fluid grace that no longer seemed merely elegant but clearly supernatural. His expression grew grave as he studied the document, and she noticed his hands clenched into fists as he read words that apparently held uncomfortable familiarity. "It is a covenant," he said finally, his voice carrying depths of old pain. "An agreement made between my kind and the mortal inhabitants of this region. Protection in exchange for sanctuary, blood freely given instead of blood forcibly taken." Elsbeth leaned closer to examine the parchment, though the archaic script proved largely indecipherable to her modern eyes. But certain phrases stood out, references to those who walk in shadow, guardians against the deeper dark, and compact sealed in scarlet witness. "You signed this," she realized, noting how his attention focused on particular sections of the text. "Your name is somewhere on this parchment, bound by promises made centuries ago." "Among others," he confirmed. "Though I am the last who still honors its terms, my kind are not naturally inclined toward restraint or service to mortals. Most who agreed to such limitations eventually abandoned them in favor of easier hunting grounds. But you remained." "I remained," he agreed, and she heard both pride and weariness in those simple words. "Not because the compact compelled me, but because I discovered that protection brought more satisfaction than predation. These people became precious to me not as potential prey, but as lives worth preserving." The implications were staggering. Everything she had been taught about vampires for that was clearly what Aldrich was. However different he might be from the monsters of legend, painted them as creatures of insatiable hunger and inevitable corruption. Yet, here was evidence of a different path, a choice to channel supernatural power toward preservation rather than destruction. "The blood on this parchment," she said, studying the dark stains with new understanding. "It represents promises kept, not lives taken." "Volunteers from among the villagers," Aldrich explained, his voice heavy with memory. "Those who understood the bargain being offered and chose to seal it with their own willing sacrifice. A few drops given freely to purchase protection for generations yet unborn." She thought of the toast Elder Greywater had spoken during the feast, words about watchers in shadow and guardians unseen that had seemed like empty ritual, but now revealed their deeper significance. The current generation had forgotten the literal meaning behind their ceremonial phrases, but the ceremony itself preserved memory of an ancient debt still being honored. "They have forgotten," she said, gesturing toward the chamber ceiling beyond which the feast continued. "The people you protect no longer remember why the blood moon ritual exists, what promise their ancestors made, or what protection they still receive. Perhaps that is for the best," Aldrich replied, though something in his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. "Fear changes people, and knowledge of what stalks the dark places might rob them of the peace they deserve. But ignorance also robs them of gratitude," Elsbeth countered. "They mock what they do not understand, dismiss as superstition what should be honored as covenant. Tonight they treated me with cruelty because I am different, but they would likely treat you with terror if they truly comprehended what you are." Aldrich was quiet for several heartbeats, his ancient eyes reflecting torchlight as he considered her words. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of accumulated loneliness and suppressed hope. "In all the years since I signed that parchment, you are the first mortal to learn the truth and respond with understanding rather than revulsion. Most would flee screaming, or perhaps attempt to stake me through the heart with whatever sharp object came to hand. I am not most mortals," Elsbeth said simply. "My conversations with plants have taught me that nature operates according to laws more complex than simple categorizations of good and evil. If you chose protection over predation, service over dominion, then you have made yourself into something worthy of respect rather than fear." The words seemed to strike him like physical blows, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked enough to reveal depths of gratitude and wonder that made her heart ache for his centuries of isolation. "Elsbeth," he said, her name carrying reverence in his cultured voice, "you cannot know what your acceptance means to someone who has walked in shadows for so long that daylight seemed like a forgotten dream." She reached out without conscious thought, her hand covering his where it rested on the ancient parchment. His skin was warm beneath her touch, more alive than dead despite whatever supernatural transformation had claimed his mortality centuries ago. "Perhaps it is time for both of us to step into the light," she suggested, surprised by her own boldness. "You need no longer walk in complete shadow, and I need no longer accept complete solitude. We have both been alone too long." Above them, thunder rolled across the castle battlements as the rain squall intensified, but in the hidden chamber lit by spontaneous torches, two souls, who had thought themselves permanently isolated, discovered that understanding could bridge even the vast gulf between mortal and immortal existence. The silver dagger gleamed with unholy light in the vampire hunter's steady grip, its blessed blade inscribed with prayers in Latin and Hebrew that promised swift destruction to any creature foolish enough to taste its edge. Brother Marcus Thorne carried himself with the righteous confidence of a man who had dedicated his life to purging supernatural corruption from God's green earth. And tonight he had finally tracked his quarry to this remote village celebration. The hunter's arrival shattered the peaceful intimacy that had developed between Elsbeth and Aldrich in the hidden chamber. They had returned to the great hall to find the feast in chaos, villagers pressed against the walls in terrified clusters, while a tall figure in monk's robes stood at the center of the ancient stones, his weapon reflecting torchlight like captured lightning. "I am Brother Marcus, of the Order of St. Michael," the hunter announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "I have traveled far to cleanse this place of the abomination that has infected it for centuries. Tonight, under the blood moon's witness, divine justice will finally be served." Elder Greywater stepped forward with the courage of his 83 years, though his weathered hands shook as he addressed the intruder. "Sir, you are welcome to share our feast, but I know of no corruption that requires—" "Silence, old man," Brother Marcus cut him off with savage intensity. "Your ignorance does not excuse your complicity. For 300 years, this village has harbored a creature of the damned, a vampire who has fed upon your blood and corrupted your souls with his unholy presence." The hunter's gaze swept across the terrified faces until it found Aldrich standing quietly beside Elsbeth near the chamber entrance. Recognition flared in the monk's dark eyes, followed by satisfaction that was nearly sensual in its intensity. "There," he said, pointing the blessed dagger toward them with unwavering precision. "Aldrich Ravencrest," called the Night Warden, last of the Covenant vampires. "You have eluded the Church's justice for far too long, demon. Tonight, your reign of darkness ends." Elsbeth felt the blood drain from her face as the hunter's words painted Aldrich not as a protector, but as a predator who had somehow deceived them all. Around the hall, villagers who had known Aldrich as a helpful stranger began to back away in horror, their faces reflecting the terror that generations of stories had taught them to associate with his kind. "You are mistaken, brother," Aldrich said calmly, though Elsbeth noticed tension gathering in his frame like a coiled spring. "I have harmed no one in this village. The compact I honor forbids—" "Compact?" Brother Marcus laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "You speak of the heretical agreement that your kind tricked these simple folk into accepting? Blood freely given in exchange for protection from imaginary threats, a deception designed to provide easy feeding while maintaining the illusion of consent." The hunter began to circle them with predatory purpose, his blessed weapon never wavering from its target. "Do you think the Holy Church ignorant of your methods, creature? We know how vampires like you establish feeding territories, how you convince mortals that willing sacrifice is somehow noble. You have turned this entire village into livestock." "That is not true," Elsbeth said, stepping forward despite the danger radiating from the hunter's presence. "I have seen the compact with my own eyes. I have witnessed his protection, his restraint. He is not the monster you describe." Brother Marcus's attention shifted to her with chilling intensity, and she saw something in his gaze that made her stomach turn. Not righteousness, but fanaticism so pure it had burned away every trace of human compassion. "Ah, the latest victim speaks," he said with mock sympathy. "Tell me, woman, has he fed from you yet? Has he convinced you that offering your blood is some sacred act rather than simple predation? The corruption spreads quickly once it takes hold." "You understand nothing," Aldrich said, and for the first time that evening his careful control began to crack. "The compact was made to prevent bloodshed, to offer protection from creatures far worse than I. These people live in safety because I stand between them and horrors you could not imagine." "Lies!" the hunter roared, raising his blessed blade toward the blood moon visible through the great hall's windows. "There are no creatures worse than vampires, no horrors greater than the undead who feast upon innocent blood. You have corrupted this place with your very presence, turned willing souls into accomplices to damnation." The silver dagger began to glow brighter, responding to the monk's fervor and the power of his consecrated prayers. Around the hall, several villagers fell to their knees in prayer, terrified by forces they could not understand, but instinctively recognized as beyond mortal comprehension. "The Church has long tolerated these isolated pockets of supernatural infection," Brother Marcus continued, his voice rising toward religious ecstasy. "But no longer. The new Pope has authorized the complete elimination of all vampiric presence, regardless of claimed benevolence or ancient agreements. Your kind will be cleansed from God's earth, and humanity will finally be free of your corruption." Elsbeth felt her world tilting on its axis as she began to understand the true scope of what was happening. This was not justice but genocide, a holy war declared against beings whose only crime was existing outside human definitions of natural law. The hunter's righteousness was so absolute that it allowed no possibility of nuance, no recognition that supernatural did not necessarily mean evil. "The people of this village are not corrupted," she said, her voice growing stronger as anger replaced fear. "They are protected. For centuries Aldrich has kept them safe from—" "From what?" Brother Marcus demanded. "From imaginary threats he invented to justify his presence? From creatures that conveniently never appear except in his stories? You have been deceived, woman, blinded by supernatural glamour into seeing benevolence where only predation exists. From me," said a new voice from the shadows near the great hall's entrance. The temperature in the chamber dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Torches guttered despite the absence of wind, and something vast and hungry stirred in the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. When the speaker emerged from the shadows, even Brother Marcus took an involuntary step backward. The creature that entered was everything the legends claimed vampires should be: tall, pale, and beautiful in the way that poisonous flowers were beautiful. Her dark hair flowed like liquid night, and her red dress seemed to be cut from shadows given substance. But it was her eyes that made every mortal soul in the chamber recognize the presence of something truly monstrous, ancient, cruel, and utterly without mercy. "Hello, Aldrich," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality of silver bells and funeral dirges. "It has been such a long time since we spoke. I trust you remember our last conversation, when you chose this pathetic village over your own kind." Aldrich's face went white as fresh snow, and for the first time since Elsbeth had known him, she saw genuine terror in his ancient eyes. "Seraphina," he breathed. "The compact is void," she finished with predatory satisfaction. "Your church friend here has provided such helpful disruption to the old agreements. When mortals break faith with vampires, vampires are no longer bound to protect mortals. Simple logic, really." Brother Marcus raised his blessed dagger toward this new threat, but the silver blade that had blazed with holy light against Aldrich barely flickered in Seraphina's presence. Whatever power sanctified the weapon, it was insufficient against a creature of her magnitude. "Impossible," he whispered, his absolute certainty cracking for the first time. "My blade is blessed, consecrated for the destruction of all undead. Your little toy might scratch one of the younger ones." Seraphina said with amusement that promised terrible things. "But I am older than your Christ, monk. I drank blood when your God was still a whisper in the desert. Your prayers hold no power over me." She turned back to Aldrich with renewed interest, ignoring the hunter entirely. "You have caused me considerable inconvenience, brother mine. 3 centuries of searching, following whispers and rumors, all to find you playing guardian to these cattle. But now, thanks to this zealot's interference, I can finally collect what you owe me." The hall erupted in screams as villagers finally understood that their ancient nightmare had become terrifyingly real. The crystal vial of sacred oil gleamed with unholy purpose in Brother Marcus's trembling hand, its contents blessed by 3 popes and consecrated in the blood of martyrs who had died fighting supernatural corruption. The oil would serve as the final component in a destruction ritual that had taken the vampire hunter decades to perfect, a ceremony designed to purge even the most powerful undead from God's creation. But as he watched Seraphina toy with terrified villagers like a cat with trapped mice, Marcus began to understand that his absolute certainty might have been catastrophically misplaced. "Sweet cattle," Seraphina cooed, her voice carrying the musical quality of wind through graveyards as she moved among the cowering villagers. "Such healthy blood, so carefully tended by my dear brother's protection. You should thank him without his guardianship. Creatures far worse than I would have found you long ago." Elsbeth pressed herself against Aldrich's side, feeling the supernatural tension that radiated from his frame like heat from forge coals. His carefully maintained human facade had cracked under the strain of Seraphina's presence, revealing glimpses of the ancient power that lay beneath his gentle manner. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the castle stones themselves seem to resonate. "Leave them alone, Seraphina. Your quarrel is with me, not with innocents, who have done nothing to earn your wrath." "Innocents?" The elder vampire laughed, the sound like crystal breaking in slow motion. "These cattle signed their ancestors' names to a compact written in blood, promising sustenance to my kind in exchange for protection from darker things. They are hardly innocent, they are livestock who forgot their place in the natural order." Elder Greywater stepped forward, with the courage that came from having outlived fear of anything death might bring. His weathered hands shook, but his voice carried the authority of someone who remembered stories that others had forgotten. "The compact was honored," he said, his words carrying across the great hall despite their tremulous quality. "Blood freely given, protection faithfully provided. We have kept faith with the old agreements, even when their meaning grew dim in memory." Seraphina's attention focused on the old man, with predatory interest that made several villagers cry out in warning. "Ah, one who remembers the true purpose of your precious ritual. Tell me, Ancient One, how many of your people still understand what price their ancestors agreed to pay? The blood offerings ceased generations ago," Greywater replied, though sweat beaded on his brow despite the supernatural chill that had settled over the hall. "The compact evolved beyond such crude exchanges." "Evolved?" Seraphina's voice carried genuine amusement now. "Or perhaps my soft-hearted brother simply allowed sentiment to override sustenance. How do you imagine he has sustained himself all these centuries, if not through the willing sacrifice your forebears promised?" The question hung in the air like a sword poised to fall. Around the hall, villagers began to look toward Aldrich with new uncertainty, wondering what terrible truth might be hidden beneath his apparent benevolence. Even Elsbeth felt a chill of doubt, though she forced herself to trust the evidence of her own observations over Seraphina's poisonous suggestions. "I have taken nothing from them that was not freely offered," Aldrich said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "And precious little even then. A few drops when someone was dying anyway, grateful for the chance to ensure their sacrifice would protect their children. Never enough to cause harm, never without consent, never from those who had years of life remaining." Brother Marcus raised his crystal vial with renewed determination, though his blessed oil seemed pitifully inadequate against the supernatural forces clashing before him. Abominations, all of you. Whether you feed on willing victims or unwilling ones, you are parasites upon God's creation. The church will burn, Serafina interrupted with casual certainty, as will this village, and every other place that harbored creatures like my wayward brother. Your holy war has consequences you never considered, monk. When you destroy the guardians, you leave the territories unprotected. She gestured toward the great hall's windows, where the blood moon hung at its zenith like a crimson eye surveying the world below. Already they come, drawn by the scent of chaos and the promise of fresh hunting grounds. My children, my rivals, my enemies, all converging on places where the old protections have been broken. As if summoned by her words, howls began to echo from the valley below, not wolves, but something that might once have been human before hunger and madness stripped away everything recognizable. The sounds grew closer, accompanied by the crash of splintering wood and screams that carried clearly through the night air. The village, Elsbeth breathed, understanding finally striking her with the force of physical blow. They're attacking the village. Aldrich's composure shattered entirely, his human mask falling away to reveal the supernatural predator that lay beneath. His eyes went completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible surface, while shadows seemed to flow around him like living things responding to their master's rage. "You orchestrated this," he said to Serafina, his voice now carrying the full weight of his ancient power. "You brought them here, used the hunter's disruption as cover for invasion." "Guilty as charged," she replied with theatrical remorse that fooled no one. "Though I must thank Brother Marcus for making it so easy. His righteous crusade has created such delicious chaos, breaking protections that took centuries to establish. The Church's war on vampires has become vampires' war on everything else." Brother Marcus's face went white as the implication struck him. Around the hall, villagers who had children or elderly relatives in the settlement below began to weep with fear and helpless anger. The very people the hunter had claimed to protect were dying because of his intervention. "This is not what I intended," he whispered, his absolute certainty finally cracking under the weight of unintended consequences. "I came to save them from corruption, not to deliver them to slaughter." "Intentions matter little compared to results," Aldrich said, his supernatural senses apparently tracking the chaos below, even from their position in the castle. 12 houses burning, perhaps more. At least 30 dead already, including children who never harmed anyone. The information struck Brother Marcus like physical blows, each death weighing against his conscience with crushing force. The sacred oil in his hand suddenly seemed like a mockery of everything he had believed about righteous purpose and divine will. "Stop this," he demanded, turning towards Serafina with desperate authority. "Call them off. These people are innocents." "I am not their master," she replied with cruel satisfaction. "I merely suggested that rich hunting grounds lay unprotected. What they choose to do with that information is entirely their own decision." Elsbeth watched the hunter's world crumble as he finally understood the complex web of supernatural politics that his simplistic worldview had never acknowledged. But there was no time for philosophical reconsideration while people died in the valley below. "We have to help them," she said, addressing Aldrich directly. "Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, we cannot stand here debating while innocents suffer." "Agreed," Aldrich replied, though his expression suggested he understood exactly how impossible their situation had become. "But fighting Serafina while protecting the villagers and dealing with her allies will require power I have not drawn upon in centuries. The cost will be worth paying," Elsbeth finished with fierce determination. "These people deserve protection, even if providing it means embracing the very darkness that Brother Marcus fears. Around them, the villagers who had fled to the castle for safety during the storm now found themselves trapped between supernatural forces that regarded their lives as pawns in a game too complex for mortal understanding. The blood moon feast that should have been a celebration of ancient protection had become something far darker, a night when old compacts would either be renewed in blood and sacrifice or broken forever in fire and death. Outside, the screams from the valley grew closer as creatures drawn by Seraphina's invitation discovered that Blackthorn Keep itself might offer richer hunting than the scattered houses below. The true test of Aldrich's centuries-old commitment to protection was about to begin, and everyone present understood that few would survive to see another dawn. The ancestral shield that Elsbeth lifted from its place on the castle wall had not been touched in living memory, its surface tarnished with age, but still bearing the heraldic symbols of House Blackthorn, a raven perched upon a thornbush beneath a crescent moon. The weight of it surprised her. Solid oak backing reinforced with steel bands that spoke of battles fought in ages when such protection meant the difference between life and death. But as her fingers closed around the leather-wrapped grip, she felt something else flow through the ancient metal courage that had nothing to do with her own limited experience and everything to do with generations of defenders who had stood against darkness. "You cannot face her with mortal weapons," Aldrich said, his supernatural senses tracking Seraphina's movement through the great hall as she continued her predatory circling of terrified villagers. "She is older than kingdoms, more powerful than armies. That shield will not turn aside her claws or her ancient malice." "Perhaps not," Elsbeth replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "But it will serve as a symbol that these people are not without protection, that someone stands between them and the darkness you have warned against for centuries." Brother Marcus had begun his destruction ritual despite the chaos surrounding them, his crystal vial of sacred oil catching the blood moon's light as he traced blessed symbols in the air. Latin prayers fell from his lips in desperate cadence, calling upon divine intervention against forces that his training had assured him must yield to righteous authority. But the holy oil seemed pitifully inadequate against Seraphina's casual cruelty, its blessed light barely visible in the supernatural shadows that had gathered around the elder vampire. "Your god is silent tonight, monk," Seraphina observed with amusement that promised terrible consequences. Perhaps he has finally realized that some of his creations were mistakes that require correction by older powers. The temperature in the great hall plummeted further as she drew upon centuries of accumulated malice, her form beginning to shift and blur as supernatural nature overwhelmed human appearance. Where moments before she had seemed merely beautiful in a dangerous way, now she revealed aspects that spoke of predation refined to art form, two sharp teeth that caught torchlight like steel, fingernails that lengthened into claws capable of rending stone, and eyes that held depths of hunger that had consumed empires. "Elsbeth, stay back," Aldrich commanded, his own transformation beginning as protective instincts overrode 3 centuries of careful restraint. "What I must become to face her is not something you should witness." But she had already stepped forward, the ancestral shield raised between Seraphina and the cluster of villagers who had pressed themselves against the far wall in terrified desperation. The weight of the ancient protection felt right in her hands, as if she had been born to wield it against exactly this sort of supernatural threat. "I have witnessed enough this night to understand that monsters come in many forms," she said, her voice carrying across the hall with unexpected authority. "Some wear the faces of righteousness while bringing destruction, others wear the faces of predators while offering protection. I choose to stand with the protector, whatever form that protection requires." Seraphina's attention fixed on her with interest that made the air itself seem to thicken with malevolent intent. How refreshing a mortal with actual courage, rather than merely blind faith or ignorant terror. "Tell me, little shield-bearer, do you understand what you face? Do you comprehend the futility of your gesture? I understand that you represent everything Aldrich has spent centuries standing against." Elsbeth replied, amazed at her own boldness in the face of such obvious supernatural superiority. I understand that breaking the ancient compact has freed you to prey upon innocents who deserve protection. The elder vampire moved closer, her form seeming to flow rather than walk, as shadows bent around her like living things eager to serve their mistress. Understanding and surviving are different skills entirely. Your ancestors' shield may have turned aside mortal blades and earthly arrows, but it will not save you from what I have become. Brother Marcus's ritual reached crescendo as he shattered the crystal vial against the stone floor, sacred oil spreading in patterns that glowed with blessed light, while his voice rose in final invocation. By the power of Saint Michael, by the authority of the Church, by the will of God Almighty, I banish all creatures of darkness from this holy ground. The explosion of consecrated power that followed was visible as golden radiance that filled every corner of the great hall, washing over vampires and mortals alike with purifying force that should have destroyed any undead presence instantly. For a moment, hope flared in the hearts of every terrified villager as divine intervention seemed to answer their desperate prayers. But when the light faded, Seraphina stood exactly where she had before, completely unaffected by the hunter's most powerful ritual. If anything, she seemed amused by the display, as if watching children play at games that held no relevance to adult concerns. "Is that the best your church can manage?" she asked, with mock disappointment. 300 years of preparation, blessed oils and sacred prayers, and the result is a light show that would barely inconvenience a lesser demon. Brother Marcus stared at his empty hands in absolute incomprehension, his worldview crumbling as forces beyond his theology proved immune to everything he had been taught to trust. The blood moon crown materialized from starlight and shadow above Elsbeth's head as ancient forces older than human civilization recognized her willingness to sacrifice everything for the protection of others. The ethereal circlet was wrought from silver moonbeams and crimson fire, its presence announcing that the cosmic balance between predation and protection had found a new guardian worthy of its power. As it settled onto her brow with weightless authority, knowledge flowed through her consciousness, understanding of compacts written in blood and starlight, awareness of the supernatural currents that governed the relationship between mortal and immortal realms. "Impossible," Seraphina breathed, her ancient confidence wavering for the first time as she witnessed something that challenged even her vast experience. "The crown chooses only once per millennium, and only those who embody perfect balance between mercy and strength. No mortal has worn it since the first compact was signed," Elsbeth finished, her voice now carrying harmonics that belonged to neither fully human nor supernatural realms. The knowledge granted by the crown revealed truths that had been hidden for centuries, including the identity of the woman who had originally negotiated peace between her kind and Aldrich's. My ancestor, Lady Catherine Blackthorne, who understood that protection was more valuable than predation. Power flowed through her like warm honey, not the raw supernatural force that Aldrich and Seraphina wielded, but something more subtle and infinitely more dangerous, the authority to command adherence to ancient laws that even elder vampires could not safely ignore. The ancestral shield in her hands began to glow with the same silver-crimson radiance that crowned her head, transforming from mere heraldic metal into a focus for forces that predated Christianity by millennia. Aldrich's transformation completed, as protective instincts overrode 3 centuries of careful restraint, revealing the supernatural predator he had become in order to serve as guardian. His human facade dissolved entirely, replaced by something that belonged to legend and nightmare in equal measure. But unlike Seraphina's revelation of pure malice, his change spoke of power channeled toward preservation rather than destruction, dangerous, ancient, but fundamentally committed to life rather than death. "The compact holds," he said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his vampiric nature. "Despite the hunter's interference, despite Seraphina's manipulation, the crown has chosen to renew the ancient agreements. These people are under protection that supersedes any individual power. Serafina snarled, her beautiful features twisting into something that revealed the monster beneath centuries of careful cultivation. One mortal woman, wearing a pretty bauble, cannot stand against forces that have devoured empires. Crown or no crown, she is still human, still vulnerable to claws that can rend steel. But when she moved to attack, flowing across the great hall with predatory speed that should have made defense impossible, the crown's power manifested in ways that defied supernatural expectation. Elsbeth did not attempt to match Serafina's inhuman velocity or strength. Instead, she simply stood firm, the ancestral shield raised with calm determination, and ancient law bent reality to accommodate her protection. The elder vampire's claws, capable of shredding stone, struck the shield's surface and simply stopped, as if they had encountered something infinitely more solid than metal and wood. The force of impact sent shockwaves through the great hall, cracking ancient stones and extinguishing half the torches. But Elsbeth remained unmoved, protected by covenant magic that recognized her willingness to sacrifice everything for others. The crown grants authority to those who serve rather than those who take, she said, her voice steady despite the supernatural forces clashing around her. You have forgotten what that means, Serafina. Power without purpose becomes mere destruction. Brother Marcus stared in absolute bewilderment as his theological understanding crumbled completely. Everything he had been taught about good and evil, about the clear distinction between holy and unholy, dissolved in the face of forces that operated according to older laws than Christian doctrine. The vampire he had come to destroy was protected by divine authority that his prayers could not touch, while the mortal woman wore a crown that spoke of powers his church had never acknowledged. Around the hall, villagers who had cowered in terror began to straighten as they felt the protective presence that surrounded Elsbeth. The crown's influence extended to encompass everyone who had gathered at the Blood Moon feast, marking them as under supernatural protection that even creatures like Serafina could not easily breach. "This is not over," the elder vampire hissed, her perfect composure finally cracking under the weight of unexpected opposition. "The crown may protect these cattle tonight, but crowns can be stolen, bearers can be corrupted. I have eternity to plan your destruction, and I have eternity to stand against you," Aldrich replied, moving to stand beside Elsbeth with newfound purpose. "The compact is renewed, the protection restored. Your invitation to chaos dies with the blood moon setting." As if responding to his words, the crimson orb that had dominated the night sky began its slow descent toward the horizon, taking with it the supernatural convergence that had brought predators from across the Darklands. In the valley below, the screams that had marked the attack on the village finally began to fade as dawn approached and creatures of the night sought shelter from approaching daylight. The immediate threat was passing, but all present understood that this night had changed everything. The old agreements were renewed, but at a cost that would reshape the relationship between mortal and immortal realms for generations to come. The wedding ring of starlight that materialized on Elsbeth's finger as the first rays of dawn touched Blackthorn Keep's ancient stones was wrought from celestial fire and moonbeam silver, its appearance marking a bond that transcended the ordinary boundaries between mortal and immortal existence. The ethereal band pulsed with the same gentle radiance that had crowned her during the night's supernatural battle, but now its light spoke of love rather than authority, of connection rather than protection. 3 months had passed since the Blood Moon feast that changed everything. The village below had been rebuilt with help from neighbors who asked few questions about the strange sounds and lights that had marked that terrible night. Most of the survivors chose to remember the events as a terrible storm that had damaged their homes and taken some of their loved ones, a more comfortable explanation than acknowledging the supernatural forces that had nearly destroyed their peaceful community. But some remembered more clearly. and their attitudes toward the woman who tended the herb garden behind the old mill had shifted from casual dismissal to respectful gratitude. They might not fully understand what Elsbeth had done during those dark hours, but they recognized that her courage had somehow saved them all. "The roses are particularly fine this year," observed Martha Brewster, the innkeeper's wife, as she examined the carefully tended garden that had become a place of pilgrimage for villagers seeking healing herbs and quiet wisdom. "Your touch with growing things seems to have grown even more skilled since the spring." Elsbeth smiled. Elsbeth, her hands gentle as she harvested lavender, whose potency had indeed increased since the night she wore the blood moon crown. The cosmic forces that had chosen her as guardian had left their mark in ways both subtle and profound, deepening her connection to the natural world while granting her insights into the delicate balance between protection and freedom. "All things grow better when they are tended with love, rather than merely duty," she replied, her words carrying layers of meaning that Martha might sense without fully comprehending. "Understanding brings out the best in any living thing, whether plant or person." Aldrich emerged from the cottage that had once belonged only to a lonely widow, but now sheltered a partnership that bridged worlds. His appearance in daylight no longer surprised the villagers, though few paused to consider how unusual it was for someone of his apparent nature to walk freely under the sun's rays. The crown's blessing had granted him freedoms that his kind rarely enjoyed, freedoms earned through centuries of service and sacrifice. "Father Benedict wishes to speak with us about the harvest festival," he said, settling beside Elsbeth on the wooden bench where they often spent evening hours discussing matters both mundane and mystical. "He has questions about incorporating acknowledgement of protective forces into the traditional ceremonies." The old priest's theological journey had been perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. Brother Marcus had departed the village within days of the blood moon feast, his absolute certainties shattered beyond repair by witnessing divine authority to protect what his training had taught him to destroy. But Father Benedict, with the wisdom that came from 40 years of pastoral care, had proven more adaptable to truths that challenged conventional doctrine. Protection comes in many forms, he had told his confused congregation during the first sermon after the terrible night. Perhaps our understanding of good and evil has been too narrow, too quick to judge by appearance rather than by actions. If someone has spent centuries keeping us safe from genuine threats, does it matter what form that protection takes? The theological implications were still being debated in letters that traveled between Blackthorn Keep and scholars in distant monasteries, but the practical result was a community that had learned to accept mysteries rather than demanding simple explanations for complex truths. The harvest festival should indeed acknowledge all who protect and preserve. Elsbeth agreed, her fingers absently touching the starlight ring that marked her commitment to both Aldrich and the responsibilities that came with supernatural guardianship. Whether they work in daylight or shadow, with mortal hands or ancient power. Elder Greywater approached through the garden paths, his weathered features holding the contentment of someone whose deepest fears had been acknowledged and addressed rather than dismissed. At 83, he was too old to pretend that the world contained only comfortable truths, too wise to reject protection simply because it came from unexpected sources. "The compact is renewed," he said, settling carefully on the grass beside their bench with the slow deliberation of advanced age. "The young ones may choose to forget what they witnessed, but those of us with longer memories understand what debt we owe. The blood moon feast will continue, but now we will remember what we are truly celebrating." In the distance, children played among the apple trees that lined the village common, their laughter bright with the fearless joy of youth, protected by forces they did not need to understand. Some of those children carried bloodlines that traced back to the original compact, descendants of families who had willingly offered their protection to powers beyond mortal comprehension. They would grow up in a world where supernatural guardianship was acknowledged rather than hidden, where the partnership between human and inhuman could flourish openly. "We have changed the nature of the agreement itself," Aldrich observed, his ancient eyes reflecting depths of gratitude that centuries of lonely service had never allowed him to express. No longer protection purchased through blood sacrifice, but protection freely given in exchange for acceptance and understanding. Elsbeth leaned against his shoulder, marveling still at the warmth that flowed between them despite the fundamental differences in their natures. The blood moon crown had taught her that love could transcend any boundary, that connection was possible between souls, regardless of whether they drew breath or beat with living hearts. Perhaps that was always what the compact was meant to become, she suggested, watching sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold above the village they had both chosen to protect. Perhaps it simply took time for both sides to understand that trust is more powerful than fear, that cooperation creates stronger bonds than coercion. As night fell over Blackthorn Keep, two unlikely guardians settled into their shared vigil, knowing that their love had become the foundation for peace that might endure for centuries to come.